October 13th, 1972. A Uruguayan Air Force plane carrying 45 people disappears over the Andes. For 8 days, search parties scour the peaks. They find nothing. The search is called off. All are presumed dead. But 27 have survived. At 11,500 feet, they are stranded with no gear, no equipment, and almost no food. Temperatures plummet to 30 below zero. The world has given them up for dead. What happens next is one of the most brutal survival stories of all time. This is survival in its most elemental form. No trees, no animals, no plants. Just cold, hunger, and despair. How did 16 survive for 72 days? The answer is ingenuity, resilience, and refusal to die. Tools to trust. Skills that last. This is Bushcraft Arsenal. Number 1. Improvised shelter, construction, and reinforcement. The survivors' first and most important survival tool was the broken fuselage of their plane. It was their only refuge from the brutal cold and the relentless wind. But it was not a ready-made shelter. It was a mangled wreck, open at both ends and filled with the debris of the crash. Their first task was to transform this tomb into a sanctuary. Using seats and luggage, they built a wall to block the open rear. They huddled together, fighting for warmth on cold metal with only thin cushions for insulation, miserable but alive. Their shelter was not safe. On the 18th day, a new horror descended upon them. An avalanche, a silent white death, swept down the mountainside and buried the fuselage in snow. 8 people were killed, and the rest were trapped in a space that was now even smaller and more terrifying. For 3 days, they were buried alive, unable to see the sun, their air supply dwindling. They had to dig their way out, using pieces of metal and their bare hands to tunnel through the compacted snow. It was a desperate, frantic effort, a battle against suffocation and despair. This disaster, as terrible as it was, taught them a crucial lesson. Their shelter was vulnerable. They had to reinforce it. They used the salvaged materials to build a stronger wall, and they developed a system for clearing the snow from the entrance. They learned to read the signs of the mountain, to listen for the telltale rumble of an approaching avalanche. Their shelter was no longer just a place to hide from the cold. It was a fortress, a symbol of their determination to survive in a world that was actively trying to kill them. Number 2. Water production in a frozen environment. In the high-altitude Andes, where the air holds 40% less oxygen than at sea level, dehydration kills swiftly. The dry air strips moisture from every breath. Surrounded by frozen water, eating snow would lower core body temperature by 2-3 degrees, causing rapid hypothermia. They needed to melt it safely. Their solution was simple but ingenious. They used the curved, reflective pieces of aluminum from the backs of the airplane seats as solar reflectors. They would pile snow onto these makeshift trays and place them in the sun. The intense high-altitude sun would heat the metal, and the snow would slowly melt, providing a steady trickle of life-giving water. It was a slow, laborious process, but it worked. They had a reliable source of drinking water, a critical resource that protected them from dehydration and allowed their bodies to continue functioning in the extreme conditions. This simple innovation was a major victory. It gave them control, proving they were not passive victims, but active survivors. Number 3. The ultimate taboo, a new food source. This is the part of the story that has shocked and fascinated the world for 50 years. It is a story of a terrible choice, a choice that pushed the boundaries of morality and survival. After their meager rations of chocolate and wine ran out, the survivors began to starve. Their bodies were consuming themselves. They knew that without a source of protein and fat, they would all be dead in a matter of days. They were surrounded by the bodies of their friends and teammates, preserved in the snow. The thought was horrific, unthinkable. But it was also their only hope. The decision was not made lightly. It was the result of days of agonizing debate, of moral and religious soul-searching. They were devout Catholics, and the idea of eating human flesh was a violation of one of their most deeply held taboos. But they were also rational young men, and they understood the grim logic of their situation. As one survivor, Roberto Canessa, a 19-year-old medical student, argued, "It is a question of our own survival. If we don't eat, we will die. It's as simple as that." The turning point came when they heard on their small transistor radio that the official search had been called off. At that moment, they knew that they were truly on their own. The world had given them up for dead. If they were to live, they would have to make a choice that no human being should ever have to make. They made a pact. If they died, they would give their bodies to their friends to eat. It was a final, desperate act of communion, a way of giving life to each other even in death. Using a shard of glass, they began the grim task. They cut thin strips of flesh from the buttocks and thighs of the deceased, avoiding the faces and hands. They ate it raw, choking it down, their minds recoiling in horror, even as their bodies cried out for the nourishment. It was an act of pure animal survival, a suspension of the rules of civilization in a place where civilization had ceased to exist. It was this terrible, necessary decision that gave them the strength to endure, the fuel to keep their bodies alive while they planned their escape. It was the ultimate sacrifice, a choice that would haunt them for the rest of their lives, but a choice that ultimately saved them from certain death. Number 4. Rudimentary medical care and triage. In the initial chaos of the crash, the survivors were faced with a horrific scene of death and injury. Many had suffered terrible wounds, from broken bones and compound fractures to severe internal injuries. With the team's doctor killed in the crash, the responsibility for medical care fell to 2 medical students, Roberto Canessa and Gustavo Zerbino. They had only limited medical supplies and almost no experience, but they rose to the occasion with a courage and a competence that was nothing short of heroic. They immediately began the process of triage, assessing the wounded and prioritizing those they could help most. They set broken bones, cleaned wounds, and did their best to comfort the dying. They used the resources they had at hand, improvising splints from pieces of the plane and using the seat covers as bandages. They were working in the most primitive conditions imaginable, with no sterile equipment, no painkillers, and no real hope of saving those who were most severely injured. All of the survivors with compound fractures eventually died, a grim testament to the severity of their injuries and the limitations of their medical care. Their work maintained order and hope. They were symbols of competence and compassion, saving lives with rudimentary medical knowledge. Number 5. Group organization and division of labor. Social organization is critical in survival. The Andes survivors were not strangers. They were teammates from the old Christians Club rugby team, bound by years of training and competition. This existing bond gave them a foundation, but they still had to establish clear structure and division of labor for their new reality. The group was led by the older, more charismatic members of the rugby team. They made the difficult decisions, they resolved conflicts, and they maintained a sense of order and discipline. They assigned tasks based on ability and physical condition. The strongest and healthiest were responsible for the most physically demanding jobs, such as clearing snow, cutting flesh from the bodies, and preparing for the expedition to find help. The less able-bodied were given tasks that were less physically demanding but no less important, such as melting snow for water, tending to the wounded, and maintaining the shelter. This division of labor was not just a matter of efficiency. It was a way of giving everyone a role, a sense of purpose, and a stake in the group's survival. It was a way of combating the despair and the sense of helplessness that could have easily overwhelmed them. It was a way of saying that they were not just a collection of individuals waiting to die. They were a society, a community, a team, and they were going to fight for their survival together. This social organization was not without its conflicts and its tensions. There were disagreements, arguments, and moments of despair. But through it all, they held together. They were bound by their shared ordeal, by their common goal, and by the deep bonds of friendship and loyalty that had been forged on the rugby field. This sense of community, this ability to work together as a team, was one of their most powerful survival tools. It was the invisible force that held them together and gave them the strength to endure. Number 6. Improvisation and tool making. The Andes survivors were stranded in a world without tools. They had no knives, no axes, no ropes, no climbing gear. They had only the wreckage of their plane and their own ingenuity. Their survival depended on their ability to see the potential in the debris around them, to turn the remnants of their old world into the tools of their new one. They were masters of improvisation. They used the sharp edges of broken glass and metal to cut the flesh from the bodies. They used the aluminum from the seat backs to melt snow. They used the seat covers for warmth and for bandages. They unraveled the wiring from the plane's electrical system and used it to stitch together their torn clothing. They were constantly experimenting, constantly looking for new ways to use the materials at their disposal. Their greatest feat of improvisation was the creation of the equipment for their expedition to find help. They had no mountaineering gear, so they had to invent their own. They fashioned a sled from a piece of the plane's fuselage, a way of carrying their meager supplies across the snow. They created a sleeping bag by sewing together the insulated lining of the plane's cargo bay, a critical piece of gear that would protect them from the deadly cold of the high-altitude nights. They made snowshoes from the seat cushions, a way of distributing their weight and preventing them from sinking into the deep snow. They even created a pair of sunglasses from a piece of tinted plastic from the cockpit, a way of protecting their eyes from the blinding glare of the sun on the snow. These were not sophisticated tools. They were crude, makeshift, and often barely functional. But they were enough. They were a testament to the survivors' ingenuity, their resourcefulness, and their refusal to be limited by their circumstances. They were a powerful reminder that in any survival situation, the most important tool is the human mind. Number 7, maintaining hope and purpose. The greatest danger in any survival situation is loss of hope. At 11,500 feet, surrounded by peaks that stretched endlessly in every direction, the survivors had every reason to give up. The cold was relentless. The hunger was constant. Death was everywhere. But they didn't give up. Their psychological resilience, forged through faith and fellowship, saved them. Their hope was fueled by a number of factors. They were a young, optimistic group, and they had a deep faith in God. They prayed together, they sang together, and they drew strength from their shared religious beliefs. They also had a powerful sense of purpose. They were not just fighting for their own survival. They were fighting for the memory of their friends and family who had died in the crash. They were determined to get back to their loved ones, to tell their story, and to ensure that their friends had not died in vain. The turning point in their psychological battle came when they heard on the radio that the search had been called off. It was a devastating blow, a moment of profound despair. But it was also a moment of liberation. They were no longer waiting to be rescued. They were in control of their own destiny. They were going to save themselves. This shift in mindset, from passive victims to active agents, was a critical factor in their survival. It gave them a sense of purpose, a reason to keep fighting, and the motivation to plan and execute their daring escape. This psychological resilience was not a matter of blind optimism. It was a conscious choice, a daily struggle against despair. They had moments of doubt, of fear, and of profound sadness. But they never lost their will to live. They were a testament to the power of the human spirit to find hope in the darkest of places, to find a reason to live even in the face of death. Number 8. The expedition for help. After 60 days on the mountain, time was running out. The spring thaw was beginning, and the bodies they relied on for food were starting to decompose in the warming temperatures. Their food source was literally melting away. They had to act. They sent their strongest, Nando Parrado, Roberto Canessa, and Antonio Vizintin, on a desperate expedition into the unknown. The expedition was led by Nando Parrado and Roberto Canessa. They were two of the strongest and most determined of the survivors, and they were willing to risk their lives for the chance to save their friends. They were accompanied by a third man, Antonio Tintin Vizintin, who would carry a large portion of their supplies. They set off on December 12th, with no mountaineering experience, no proper equipment, and only a vague idea of where they were going. They climbed for 3 days, scaling a 15,000-foot peak, their bodies screaming in protest at the thin air and the brutal cold. When they reached the summit, they were met with a devastating sight. In every direction, as far as the eye could see, there were more mountains. There was no sign of the green valleys of Chile that they had been so desperately hoping to find. It was a moment of profound despair. They had gambled everything on this expedition, and it seemed that they had failed. But they did not give up. They made the difficult decision to send Tintin back to the fuselage to conserve their meager supplies. Parrado and Canessa would continue on alone. They descended the mountain and began a long, grueling trek through the valleys, following a river downstream, a sign that they were heading towards lower ground. For 10 days they walked, their bodies wasting away, their minds on the verge of collapse. They were driven by a single desperate thought. They had to keep going. They had to find help. They had to save their friends. Number 9. Communication and Rescue. On the 10th day of their expedition, Parrado and Canessa saw a man on horseback on the other side of a raging river. It was the first sign of human life they had seen in 72 days. They were saved, but they were not safe. They were separated from their rescuer by a torrent of icy water, and they were too weak to cross. They had to find a way to communicate, to bridge the gap between their world of death and his world of life. Parrado tried to shout, but his voice was lost in the roar of the river. He tried to mime the crash of a plane, but the man on the other side seemed to think he was a madman. Finally, the man, a Chilean farmer named Sergio Catalan, had an idea. He tied a note and a pen to a rock and threw it across the river. "Tell me what you want," the note said. With trembling hands, Parrado wrote a message that would become one of the most famous in the history of survival. "I come from a plane that fell in the mountains," he wrote. "I am Uruguayan. We have been walking for 10 days. In the plane, there are still 14 injured people. We have to get out of here quickly, and we don't know how. We don't have any food. We are weak. When are you going to come and fetch us? Please. We can't even walk." He threw the rock back, and Catalan read the note. He raised his hand in a gesture of understanding and rode off to get help. The next day, the rescue began. Helicopters were dispatched to the crash site, and the 14 remaining survivors were airlifted to safety. The ordeal was over. The 16 survivors of Uruguayan Air Force Flight 571 were going home. Number 10. The Will to Live. In the end, the story of the Andes survivors is a story about the power of the human will. It is a story of 16 young men who refused to die, who refused to be beaten by the cold, the hunger, the darkness, and the despair. They were pushed to the absolute limit of human endurance, and they did not break. They held on to their hope, their dignity, and their humanity, in a world that seemed determined to strip them of all three. This will was collective, a bond forged in hardship. They shared everything, encouraged each other, and refused to let anyone fail. They were driven by a powerful love for their families, a desperate desire to see their loved ones again. They were also driven by a sense of responsibility to their friends who had died in the crash. They were determined to live, to tell their story, and to ensure that their friends had not died in vain. This sense of purpose, this belief that their lives had meaning, was a powerful antidote to the despair that threatened to consume them. Conclusion: the story of the Andes survivors is a story that has been told and retold for 50 years. It is a story that has been analyzed, debated, and sensationalized. But at its heart, it is a simple story about the power of the human spirit to overcome even the most impossible of odds. It is a story that reminds us that as long as we have hope, as long as we have courage, and as long as we have each other, we can endure anything. What do you think was the most critical factor in the survival of the Andes group? Was it their ingenuity, their teamwork, or their controversial decision to resort to cannibalism? Let me know in the comments below. And for more stories of survival against all odds, be sure to check out our video on the incredible journey of Shackleton and the crew of the Endurance. See you in the next episode.